We have the next presenter, which is remote. It's Farzaneh Badiei with a presentation about the impact of sanctions on access to the essential properties of the internet in the Middle East. But while we set up the connection, while we set up the Zoom call, I wanted to show you this slide that's about a Telegram group that we established. I work at the Internet Society together with RIPE NCC. It's about routing security for the Middle East. It's a very lightweight group. We try to keep it on topic to discuss about routing security. And I would like to see you there because we have a focus on the Middle East there. We publish news, articles, but we enjoy also trying to get conversations going about how to implement more routing security in the region. So we're good. We're ready to go. So I'll leave the stage to Farzaneh, who's I think in the US right now, and she'll be presenting about the impact of sanctions on accessing the critical properties of the internet in the Middle East. So good morning and welcome.
A topic that has affected the Middle East and internet connectivity in the Middle East for a long time. And it is a hot topic at the moment in the Western Europe as well. So, so I changed the title a little bit. So it's about economic sanctions and the impact on internet development in the Middle East. I'm going to give you a few examples. So this is a part of the research that is being funded by RIPE NCC. We are working on understanding the impact of sanctions on access to the internet, and the collection of information surrounding this study is still in progress. If you want to provide feedback, concerns, your experiences, just scan that QR code and let us know. So the objectives of this presentation today is to kind of raise awareness so that you can make informed decisions when peering, find legal solutions when peering with sanctioned countries, maintaining interconnectivity, and collect and document the unreported impact of sanctions on internet development in the Middle East. So what are these sanctions? By sanctions, I actually mean economic sanctions. There are various types of sanctions that are imposed by nation states on other nation states or entities and individuals in order to change their behavior or punish them. And kind of create a change in the regime or geopolitical influence. It includes trade restrictions, travel ban, and the freezing of assets and arms embargoes. We focus on economic sanctions that might have an impact that might include like freezing of assets as well. Economic sanctions have had implications for what we call the internet now, at least since late 90s. They have had implications even before that, but internet was not a network. It was not as well developed before that, but there were implications as well. And then the implications for the internet have been increasing in the past decade, especially in the Middle East. And from early on, even the implications for the internet and communication was acknowledged by those decision makers that imposed sanctions, and they came up with relief mechanisms and other licenses and exemptions in order to mitigate the impact on communication. So I'm going to go through a timeline. It's not we are trying to complete it, but so in 2001, after the 9/11 terrorist attack, the U.S. Took a more aggressive stance for sanctions, but it also tried to be more targeted, and they call it smart sanctions. That they try to target the decision maker and the state operators rather than ordinary citizens. It was sanctions were tightened on Afghanistan, and we hear a few cases of how sanctions impacted the internet from between 2001 and 2010. But as you can see, it's not very complete. But in Sudan, one of the reasons that they argued for the redelegation of the CCTLD, the country code top level domain, was not happening was because of sanctions. It was also that that .sd was not operational because partly due to sanctions and of course other factors. When they like advocates for interconnectivity, they discuss this issue with the U.S., especially because of the events and uprisings that used a lot of the online services in order to organize themselves against the regimes and against oppressive regimes. So in 2010, the U.S. came up with a few sanction reliefs for personal communication and for the internet in Iran, Cuba, and Sudan. And then, but then again, we had European sanctions that for Syria in 2011, and these sanctions were in place since 2007. But we heard reports of how these sanctions in 2012 affected access to the number of resources to IP addresses in Europe, and so Syria and Iran IP addresses were. Like they had to, Internet Governance Organization and number of resources, they had to make sure that they were in compliance with sanction regimes while serving Syria and Iran. Then we have like a host of other sanctions that were imposed on this time network operators, and there was this internet service provider in Iran that the U.S. sanctioned specifically. After coming up with the Human Rights Information Technology Executive Order, because it was tracking people and was tracking people during the uprising in Iran. We heard reports of how Sudan's civil society was frustrated because of U.S. sanctions and how it affected their access to the digital technology and the internet. And between 2015 to 2019, we see a lot of effort in order to ease the sanctions on various countries, especially Cuba and Iran. In 2021, we were concerned that because of the Taliban takeover, some of their access might be affected because the Taliban heads are sanctioned on a sanction list, and we were concerned that their access to IP addresses might be affected because of this takeover. And then also it was challenging to verify who controls these addresses. But at the moment we are monitoring the situation, and there's still it doesn't seem like that the sanctions have affected their access yet. And in 2022 we have had the Iran, and so because of the Iran's recent uprising, Again, they used the internet for the uprising effectively, and the U.S. came up with sanction reliefs for, like, for example, cloud services. The foreign cloud services were exempted, and they could provide services to Iranians. But also the U.S. sanctioned the Minister of Communication, along with others, due to internet censorship, and also EU sanctioned a cloud service in Iran because of the tracking and filtering activities. So here is the sanction timeline. You can scan this, and you can give us comments, and we are very interested to know your experiences, even if like it's before 2000. We want to see how the sanction regime have impacted the evolution of the internet as well. So now the categorizing the impact. So sanctions have had an impact on regional internet registry services. They have also had an impact on inequitable access to number resources because of the indirect consequences. So despite the fact that the countries try to come up with sanctions that are smart and want to target those decision makers and people that actually come up with oppressive mechanisms and are dictators, despite those efforts, that's still because the economic sanctions are so widespread and affect financial services, they affect ordinary people as well. So it happens that their access to number resources will be affected as well. There's impact of sanctions on network operators and impact of sanctions on domain name registration, which I'm going to go through quickly about. So the impact on the RIRs, that transferring from one RIR to another, payment systems that they use. Sometimes payment systems do not want to serve you if you are, it doesn't matter if you're like on a special designated national list or an ordinary person. If you are based even in a sanctioned country, payment system might not want to serve you. Software providers, the same thing. RIR's new membership, assignment, allocation, and there have been cases that RIPE NCC has transparently reported on about Iran and Syria IP addresses. So what is the impact on network operators? So the revocation of membership from internet exchange points that can result to depeering. And we hear this case because of Russia waging a war on Ukraine, and then they were sanctioned by the UK, and the two of the CEOs of two of those people who were sanctioned were actually the CEOs of the telecom operations. So London Internet Exchange had to disconnect. Disconnect is the wrong word. I'm sorry, I have it on the list. Like they had to revoke their membership from the exchange point. So that which leads to depeering. It also affects other people, other network operators to want to peer with them. It also affects those smaller operators that actually rely on these larger network operators to facilitate traffic. And as I said, the individual members of the exchange point, they do not want to peer with sanctioned people and sanctioned countries. And so we have also like reportedly there has been like Syrian operators that other operators did not want to peer with them because they were based in Syria. But we don't have a lot of these reports about the Middle East, unfortunately. it doesn't mean that it hasn't happened, but there might be reservation and hesitation to peer with sanctioned countries' networks. So if you have cases, you can anonymously also tell us if you have faced issues peering. So reservations include being fined, operational issues such as banks not willing to facilitate payments, and as I said, these cases are underreported, and this case of de-peering because of sanction, we only heard it because of the case of Russia and Ukraine. So there are also reports that cache servers that store information on a local network, and they help with better quality and faster download, and can impact and can facilitate access quite a bit. They can be impacted by sanctions. So for example, Google shut down the cache servers that they had in Russia. And there are reports that in Afghanistan, the cache servers are also deactivated. This is also another case that in the Middle East, it's either that they don't have access to cache servers, or that we have not heard the cases. So it would be great if we could document if there are such cases that cache servers were not provided because of sanctions. And then the domain name registration. Sorry, I don't know how much time. Okay, so the domain name registration is also has also been affected quite a bit. There are different. So, for example, in Sudan, the CCTLD redelegation, as I mentioned, was later on facilitated, but in the beginning it was not possible to redelegate because of sanction. And then Iran and Syria lack access to new GTLDs. So some new GTLDs such as .asia and .ngo come up with clauses that says that, like blanket clauses, that they do not accept registration from people. It's not like certain entities or anything like that. It's just like people in general who are residents of Iran and Syria and a bunch of and Sudan. Sudan, it was there a few years ago. I'm not sure if it's there now. And also, the registrars over comply with sanctions. For example, there was this domain name registrar reseller club that stopped supporting clients and users from Iran, Sudan, Syria in 2013. And this has been a struggle for some of these Middle Eastern countries to register domain names, and it has made them like move to their CCTLD. So the U.S. general licenses, while explicitly did not exempt domain name registration, now that might have changed. A lot of changes are happening in the sanction regime this year because of Russia and Ukraine, but we don't know. But still there are struggles with domain name registration. And then also sanction. So I think I have discussed this. The payment systems are problematic. There are sanction-locked countries. The inability to peer with your neighbors make network operator dependent on more expensive and less efficient peering arrangements. And the ambiguity that is in the sanction regime creates risk-averse legal practices and over-compliance. But there is hope. Like, for example, a few years ago, there was a peering exemption for Cuba in the U.S. sanction regime. But because the sanction regimes, because the companies come up with their compliance mechanism, it's very difficult for them to kind of like move back and change that compliance mechanism, even when you get exemption. But this was good news. It would be good if they also like do this for other countries. But the hope is limited, of course, because even when in 2022, they saw that Russia internet access might actually be impacted because of the sanctions. They advocated for this internet carve out, and they amended that sanction regulation, which said that the provision of associated facilities and services necessary for the operation, maintenance, and security of electronic communication services. But so it provided some relief for electronic communication services in Russia, in Ukraine, in the Union, and between these countries. It's still this internet carve-out, despite the fact that Middle Eastern countries have been struggling with this for a long time, at least a decade. This was not applicable to Middle Eastern countries, and well, maybe one way of overcoming this is to also go and ask the EU to kind of expand its carve-out. So what's next? Collective action to legally comply with sanctions, but also be able to peer in the Middle East, report and document instances when sanctions affect fundamental operations necessary for interconnectivity and access to global internet, and then find appropriate venues to discuss how sanctions impact the internet. You can get in touch with us if you want to talk about your experiences, comments, concerns, or anything that can help us with this research, and also provide some relief for removing barriers for internet development in the Middle East. Thank you.
Hello, Farzaneh. This is Hisham Ibrahim, RIPE NCC. Thanks for the talk. That needs to, yeah, okay. Now you can see me, I guess. Again, Hisham Ibrahim, RIPE NCC. Thanks, Farzaneh, for the talk. And indeed, some of what you said, I've seen myself. In 2019, we had operators from Syria here at MENOG, and they went around trying to establish peering agreements. Unfortunately, they've been told by a lot of the people that they were discussing with that legal in their organizations will not allow that because of all the red tape, even though those organizations were not sanctioned per se. My question is to you, and I think you covered it in some of your discussions, but A, how clear is it in terms of documentation, what can organizations like this do or not? The overcompensation in terms of compliance, what can be done there, and what can an operator that isn't on a sanctions list but is denied because of overcompliance, what could they do? Is there a mechanism that you found that they can, or a path that they can go under through, like the Cuba example that you mentioned? Thanks.
Those are really easy questions, Hisham. Thank you. So there are a few. Unfortunately, because of the ambiguity of the sanction regimes, and also because those who impose sanctions, they don't know the details of the operation of how the internet works. And then we have to like bring these the impact to their attention and explain why, when they come up with a sanction regime from the beginning, to exempt a host of services that can have an impact on access to the internet. So we are talking about entry to the internet. We are not talking about like services that make our lives better. We are talking about online presence. So one thing is to discuss is to discuss with these decision makers what should be exempted. The other is that the network operators that want to peer with others, they should also discuss with sanction experts who can tell you that if you whether you are allowed to peer with them, because there might be some exemptions for peering, for example, there is in the US, and then also they can move away from that risk averse stance and try to provide their services while abiding by the law. And for the operators, some processes allow the operators to go to the sanction officials and get an exemption. So there can be like specific licenses, but at the moment it's very rudimentary, it's very basic, it's very unknown. So I'm not giving you real, like these are some solutions, but the effectiveness, unfortunately, has been minimal. Okay, is there another question?
I think we don't have any other any addition from Hisham. So thanks. Okay, so Nishal.
Thanks, Max. Nishal Gabadan, No Hats. So to the presenter, who's very difficult to see now, I have a question that's disguised as a lightning talk. I grew up in apartheid South Africa. We were subject to United States sanctions from 84 to about 86. And I remember at the time, I was much younger, I'm not going to give you my age, I was told we're not going to get Coca-Cola, which was a big thing to somebody that was my age at the time. That didn't happen, by the way. We got Coke just fine, and KFC and the rest of it. So, you know, the net effect of sanctions on South Africa is something we can discuss outside. But I want to bring that into what you think the net effect of sanctions is really going to be on this part of the world or other parts of the world. When I got online, the United States was the center of the internet. That was in the 90s. The United States is no longer the center of the internet for all of us. Everybody in this room, except if you're from Trumpistan, I apologize. But for the rest of us, it isn't. I don't run a network anymore, but I know the measure of my traffic that goes to the US, and it's small. Yes, there's US network operators, etc., but my expectation and understanding from conversations with those US operators is that they're happy to peer. In fact, they want to peer with networks. I've had a one-on-one discussion with the person that runs peering at one of those big network operators for this region that says, we're happily peer. As long as we don't do a bilateral session, that's okay with us. So in your talk, you referenced payment gateway systems. And that's obviously the Western payment gateway systems. That's Visas and the MasterCards and blah blahs of the world. And that's a problem, clearly. But what about alternate payment gateway systems? You know, AliChat and someone help me, WeChat, is that a payment gateway system? Or Union Pay? All of these things are rising. And while I'm not advocating for them, I'm saying that alternatives exist anymore. So do you really believe that these sanctions are doing much? And they're hurting connectivity in this part of the world? Because from my nuanced perspective, I don't see that happening. When you say registries can't use Visa and MasterCard to process payments, they're happily able to use other alternate systems. And at the end of the day, fundamentally, people are really going to do what serves their pocket. And I know this because in my first year of university, I lived with the folks that were responsible for bringing Coke and KFC into South Africa during apartheid years. They told me the wonderful back-channel stories that they used to do it. We can talk outside if you want. So who's the sanctions really hurting? Is it making a difference? Thank you. Oh, I'd still like to know your answer.
Yeah, so sanctions have been, so for the RIRs, they cannot transfer their IP addresses at the moment. And they cannot, and some of the, for example, the software. So when you want to do DNSSEC training for the Middle East, especially for like if there are American organizations, they do not provide those trainings for Iranians, and it's not and the indirect consequences of sanctions. Yes, we are. It is very because the financial network is so it's so massively dominated by the U.S. Even if like when a Russian bank was sanctioned by the U.S., then Afghanistan could not do certain transactions, and it's not a. So I understand also like your analogy to Coke and burger, and as an Iranian, I assure you that we also didn't have and still don't have Coke and well, we have burger. What is McDonald's? But the problem is that these sanctions are impacting the access to essential properties of the internet that are necessary for actually getting online, for your online presence. And you know that better than me from your other presentations. So for the peering, the US companies, I have also talked to the to the US companies that some of them peer and some of them don't. But the reason because they go and peer with others is that the US OFAC came up with a license that kind of like is the sanction for peering, and like also they interpret the OFAC license broadly when it comes to telco operators. This hasn't happened in the EU yet, and we are having extensive problems. And I think that the domain name registration I have discussed and I have documented these problems, but I think the cache servers also, I made an example. I mean, if you are saying that we should go to the alternatives, yes, but we should really start doing that if alternatives work. The problem is that those alternatives also can be sanctioned, and then we can't. Like the US as like the superpower came up with a system that can affect us globally wherever we are, and this is why they think it was a clever idea. But I also invite you to read the report too. Hopefully I will be able to detail how actually our internet access to internet is impacted by sanctions and how network operators are impacted. Thank you.
Okay. We don't have any more questions, Farzaneh, so thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.